I appreciate everybody joining me today. This is Bob Clements, and I am the president of Axiom Group. And today we're going to be doing another Retail Responds webinar. This is the second one in the series that we've done. And the goal with Retail Responds, these webinars, as well as the website and the series of blog posts that we've launched, is to really help inform retailers as to what's going on with the COVID-19 crisis. I know we all tend to be very much focused on what's going on around us. The goal of Retail Responds is really to create a community that allows us to share ideas, share our different perspectives, and ultimately help us all through the coronavirus pandemic. Now, today, well, I guess before I get into that, let me say that we will be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions, if you'd like for us to talk about any topics in particular, please feel free to use the chat window. We will keep an eye on that today. And if any questions come in, John and I will try to address it as we move on. Now, today's topic is really focused around how do you balance the need to react to the here and now versus the need to prepare for the future. And to have that conversation with me today, I've invited John Liebler to join me. Now, John is a retail veteran. He's been in retail for most of or all of his career, having started out at a national jewelry chain, working up his way in field leadership, field store operations, and then he went on to be vice president of retail for Shinola, and then became a workforce management consultant. And recently, John joined Axiom as our director on our delivery team in North America. John brings, needless to say, a wealth of experience and knowledge to this conversation. And I guess what I'd like to do is actually stop the slides and turn on our videos and welcome John to the webinar today. John, nice to see you.
Thanks, Bob. Good to see you too.
I guess where I'd like to start today is with a fairly simple question, which is what lessons can we learn from the past, and how to help us better manage our current reality and the future?
Yeah, Bob. First, let me start by saying I think it's important that in any situation, really no matter how challenging, we do have the ability to change our perspective and look at things, the obstacles, and start to think of them as opportunities, right? And that's much of what we're going to talk about today. To move from that reactivity that we are all doing, how do we catch up to what's happening, and then start to become proactive and plan for the future. And looking back historically will give us some guidance. Now, I fully admit this is unprecedented, right? There's never been this type of global impact. However, we can still look at other events and draw some conclusions and make some decisions based on those events. And we'll use really just two examples. Katrina comes to mind, and while it hit really a smaller geographical area, it was 90,000 square miles. It was the size of, not the hurricane itself, but the area impacted was the size of the United Kingdom. 3 million people had no electricity. Unfortunately, 1,200 people lost their lives. Massive economic devastation. Hundreds of thousands is unemployed, and over 1 million people were displaced by it. It was a major event. Now, for myself, I was running field operations at the time, and we had 11 stores in that area. And I was thinking back, what did we do well and what did we not do well, and how were things impacted? So of my stores, 3 never opened. Malls never reopened. It was terrible for them, but we also saw this massive shift in where the money was going. As the economy recovered, as people started to come back to the area, we started to pick up market share in other places from either competitors or from our own closed stores. Had we been more prepared, we probably could have taken advantage of that opportunity. I think the other more recent event was the recession. We think of it in terms of 2008, and if you were in retail, it was amazing to see the light switch just get turned off. But it went on for years. Really, we didn't come out of the recession until 2011. Again, there was opportunity to be had there. from my perspective, we saw 2 or 3 of our competitors go out of business, which was unfortunate. But as an organization, we were able to strategize in how we could pick up that market share. We got leaner. We looked at our processes. We were able to take additional cash flow because of that and move it into training, increased marketing, and came out of it stronger than we went in. And I think those are the lessons that we really should be thinking about. I mean, the reality is some businesses will not survive this, but the businesses that make the right decisions, strategize, will come out stronger.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's interesting, the 2 examples that you gave. I'm a bit of a runner, and in the morning when I go for my runs, I have headphones in. I don't listen to music. I listen to podcasts. I'm a little bit of a nerd. And of course, all podcasts these days are about coronavirus. And one of the podcasts I was listening to today was actually drawing conclusions or drawing examples from the past. And they hit on both of the examples that you just hit on, which were Katrina and the recession. And what's interesting about both of those examples is that they are microcosms, and that's hard to believe, but they're microcosms of where we're at today. Katrina had a devastating economic impact on a relatively small area. Today, fortunately, we're not faced with the same destruction that happened at Katrina at the time. Our buildings are still standing, and the infrastructure is still in place. But the economic and devastation, I think, is really comparable. But it's at a global level, and for a lot of people here, it truly is our whole world. The recession's an interesting comparison as well, because it was a time where spending got pulled back, people lost their jobs, but again, it's a fraction of what it is today, where we have had almost 10 million unemployment claims in the last 2 weeks, and that number will continue to grow over the next couple of weeks. So it feels very bleak, but then the pundits also talk about, hey, we're going to hit this deep recession now, but we're probably going to come out of it because the fundamentals of the US economy and the global economy were relatively strong. So I guess if we think about that, what are some of the proactive steps that retailers should be thinking about to really help manage in the short term, whether that gets us through this initial stay-at-home order that most of us are experiencing, in store closures, or maybe just beyond? What can we think about as retailers?
Well, and Bob, I think that's really what's important, right? How do we think short-term and long-term, and what can we be doing now to be more prepared? So let's, to your point, start with the short-term. We're going to reopen, right? We don't know when. I'm an optimist. I'd like to think we get open by Mother's Day, right?
I love that idea.
Yeah. But let's just think of that for a second. What do we know? We know we're not going to open at one time, right? We use the analogy, light switches went off. The light switch is not going back on. We're not going to open up every retail location at one time. It's very likely going to come in waves. And it's either going to come in geographically in some cases, as varying states reduce their restrictions. It may come by business type, or even within the same type, location type. So for instance, if you have both mall and off-mall stores, likely your off-mall stores may see restrictions be released more quickly. And so as an organization, are you planning for these multiple contingencies, and within that having variability within those plans? If we did use Mother's Day as a guideline, it's going to be really interesting. One, we don't really understand the traffic patterns. I would suggest that we likely will see this pent-up demand come, and we will be seeing greater traffic, but again, I'm an optimist. What's really important is to understand your workforce and what's happened. So many companies have furloughed people. They may not all be available. Yes, you brought up that there were 10 million unemployment claims, but I also read an article today of the 60 companies that are hiring desperately, right? Tens of thousands of people may end up going from this furlough and take other jobs. We can't assume they'll be available to us. So questions become then, how are you determining that? How are you communicating with your employees? And do you have an effective communication system in place today for when you want to bring them back? As we start to open up these stores, does your workforce management system allow for, we'll use an example, shared or borrowed employees? So if you open up in one part of the state or one part of the county, or one brand, can you share between those brands or between those stores, and is that visible on your workforce management schedule? So as you open up these stores, you're being the most effective and the most efficient with those. Overtime. We had a great discussion yesterday about overtime. Many retailers say no overtime. This might be a time where you revisit that policy. Not all overtime is bad. And I would suggest as we come out of this, whether it's Mother's Day or down the road, there's going to be this time we have to scramble, not only to cover for traffic, but how are you retraining your people on these new processes? How are you getting the inventory moved around, right? Does all the inventory have to leave because it was pre-corona and you want to send it back for sanitizing, right? Are there new processes that will be put in place because as these stores open up, there may be social distancing restrictions in place initially? How are you getting your teams involved in that? So I think these are all the type of questions that retailers need to be asking. And then what's really interesting is as HQs have also had people furloughed, do you have the team available to do these whiteboard sessions, to do these strategy sessions so you can get to the right answers?
Yeah, I think those are great points. I really do. You know, I think the challenge of staffing your store as we reopen is going to be it's going to be unique because we're going to be in a position where most retailers that are closed now, obviously I'm not talking about the grocers and home improvement stores and pharmacies that are open, but most retailers that have closed stores have either laid off or furloughed large numbers of their employees. And I think getting those employees back is going to be challenging, especially on a kind of a rolling basis if we do open up over time. And I think that's going to create some unique challenges in terms of how do we staff a store, because you may open up, you know, the standalone stores rather than the mall stores like you talked about. And when you open up those stores, are you going to be able to pull people in from, are you going to have enough staff by that store by default? Or as you're talking about, do I need to start pulling in workers from the mall stores and things like that? And are those people going to be available? And at what point am I not staffed enough that I can't open that store? And what do I do?
Yeah.
And
how do you prioritize those stores that are most important and make the appropriate shifts, right?
Exactly. And then I think the other challenge is that while you're going to be welcoming these people back, and I think that most retailers will you know, want to welcome back their full-time experienced employees, I think those are the employees that are going to be most challenged to be still available because they're going to be good at what they do. And then I think that when they do come back, that whatever that staff is, there's going to need to be some retraining involved, whether that's simply a refresher on operations, but more importantly, there's going to be kind of a recognition that hey, we've got different procedures right now. You mentioned kind of how do we account for social distancing in our labor model and in our store procedures. I think there's so many examples that are going to have to be considered. And as we talk to our customers, John, I know as you've talked to your customers, we keep hearing over and over again of these little challenges that people are thinking about as they start to think about reopening.
Yep.
I guess to that end, and I will talk a little bit more about it at the end, is over the next several weeks as we do Retail Responds and do these webinars, we're going to be talking a little bit more and more about how do we move forward? What do we need to be thinking about during store openings? And so, you know, I guess stay tuned for more of that conversation, not that we're done today, because I think the next question that I wanted to ask you, John, is we talked about the short term and the idea that we're going to be reopening stores and that's not going to be all at once, and it may look a little bit, you know, our labor model may look a little bit different in the short term. But if we start thinking a little bit more about the long term, you know, whether it's as we get into the fall or as we get into the holiday season or next spring, a year from now, how will the coronavirus change retail as we think of it today? And what do we need to start thinking about from a long-term, from a planning perspective?
Yeah, Bob, that is to me really the most fascinating question in all of this.
Or most exciting, maybe.
It's well said, you know, and we talked about this yesterday. I had 2 conversations this week with executives, you know, at large retailers. And one of them told me he's working harder now than he's worked in quite some time. And why? 1, because his staff has been reduced. 2, because they're doing some reaction. But 3, he said to me, I'm looking to reimagine my business. And that really resonated with me. And he said, I have this rare opportunity because my stores are closed, that I can look back with a white sheet of paper and start making decisions about what I would do if I was starting the business from scratch. Because so often there are changes you want to make, but you can't because you're in flight. They're just too challenging.
Yeah.
Right? There are ways you may or may not impact your labor model based on what you anticipate, but again, you can't do it in flight. So that then becomes the question: who are the visionaries on your team that can start to think about reimagining? And just give a couple examples here. Zumiez is now using their stores today as fulfillment centers, right? They've already made that shift to where they're seeing that they can look at the opportunity and do same-day delivery or do curbside pickup, right? And does this become the natural state as we move forward?
Along those lines, John, you know, for I won't say years, because it's still a relatively new phenomena, but grocers have had dark stores. Yes. Where they're, you know, former stores that they maybe closed down that effectively become mini distribution centers for click and collect and for delivery. To me, I can see that exploding with specialty retailers who are going to have leases and maybe not want to reopen or need to reopen all the stores. And I think we're going to see an acceleration of omni-channel. It's happening already today, right? So we're not going to measure incremental growth in omni-channel, but almost exponential growth over the next year, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. I'm looking at my own behaviors, and I've never used curbside pickup before. I will likely, you know, now that I'm in the application, I can go ... That's going to get me more involved there. Having said that, that doesn't mean brick and mortar goes away all of a sudden, because there is still this need, for being social, right? The value in seeing each other, and brick and mortar provides that for people. There's also this combination. Yesterday, we talked about this. I did a live video chat. So I was looking online for something, don't need to talk what the product is. It was a gift from my wife. And of course I can't go into the store. I had many questions. It provided me the opportunity of a virtual appointment. I picked a time. I got a Zoom info invite. 8 o'clock at night, I jumped on it, and there was Jeremy. So Jeremy, if you're watching, props. He was in San Francisco in his apartment. He was a full-time employee. They shipped him a computer and a headset. And we had a 30-minute sales conversation. He was brilliant. He was brilliant, and the connection was amazing. That now can become a new business model. Appointment booking. This is something that companies really need to look at, because if we continue any level of social distancing, how can you use appointment booking to then calculate who's coming in and when they're coming in, and then staff appropriately? Bob, you brought up yesterday about fitting rooms. Like, how does that change fundamentally how you do business on getting people in and out of those rooms? These are all the ways we can start to reimagine our business to a certain extent.
I think those are great. I think those are great examples. And I think when we think about the future, I kind of bucket things in my head into two buckets, right? One bucket is things that we do today that are going to change. And they might change because of new restrictions or knowledge or cultural norms that have been established as a result of the coronavirus, right? The fitting room is a good example. Hey, we need to sanitize after it's been used. We need to recover the merchandise from there differently. We need to do this. We need to do that. It could also represent areas of the business that hasn't created enough labor. And again, because I'm a WFM geek, I talk about things in labor, right? But when we think about like click and collect or BOPUS or any of the omni-channel processes, for most retailers, these are super inefficient processes because they don't have either the equipment or the technology or frankly the volume to worry about how do we make it more efficient. But as we see a rise in online, I think we're going to see a need to go back in and really redesign those processes to be as efficient as possible and to really recognize that, hey, I can't spend as much on labor as that ramps up. The second bucket, so that first bucket is things that we do today that need to be different going forward. The second bucket are those things that are new, those things that we haven't had to consider before or didn't consider before, or maybe we did but didn't take it seriously, like the video chat. I mean, how powerful would that be for a sales associate to be able to do video chats in the store, from home, whatever it was. Again, we got time things that we need to think about there, but that would be an incredibly powerful way to build a bridge with your customer, to show them merchandise in a way that was convenient for them, and then to arrange a very specific time or opportunity for them to come in and try it on, or to see it in person, or maybe you just conduct the transaction remotely. But it becomes a really interesting way, I think, to grow the business and create a different connection. I think, are there any other kind of new ideas or we might think about working differently that are on your mind?
Well, I think there are probably dozens, right? I think the most important part of this conversation is to go back to the beginning, is how are retailers being proactive and looking at their business and having this type of dialogue, whiteboarding it and going, how do we want to take this time to anticipate and then react, right?
Oh, John, you're so practical, pulling me back into the here and now.
And then I think it's important to also then look at, and you said you're WFM geek, let's talk labor for a second. There's a reality here where you do have the opportunity to right size or reallocate your labor model based on not only what you've learned from the past, but what you're seeing in the future, and taking the time to do that. So as you're bringing your teams back on, they're coming on to this new labor model, and it becomes a very comfortable, easy, natural transition.
Yeah. Well, you know what? We're just about out of time. I think maybe that's a good place to leave our conversation today. John, I really want to thank you for your insight and your time. If you're interested in reading more about John's, wait, I'm trying to do too much at the same time, sorry. If you're interested in reading more about John's perspective, as well as perspectives of others from Acxiom, I encourage you to go to retailresponds.com. That is Acxiom's website that is dedicated to everything that we've been putting out around the coronavirus and our current state of retail. So it will include this webinar once we save it and record it and upload it. It includes last week's webinar. It includes a series of blog posts that we've already started and been adding to weekly or daily almost. It also includes key updates around the coronavirus. And again, that's at retailresponds.com. The next thing I wanted to mention is that this is the second webinar that we've done, and we are going to do this again next week. Now, rather than being on Friday morning for those of us in North America or Friday afternoon for those of us in the UK, we are going to move it to Thursday because we recognize that next Friday is Good Friday and many people have that day off. So please join us at 8:30 a.m. Pacific, 11:30 a.m. Eastern, and 4:30 p.m. British summertime. Actually, that should be British summertime rather than GMT, but that's what they just changed times last week and I forgot. So sorry about that. And in the meantime, if there is anything that we can do for you, any questions that you might have, any thing you'd like to delve in further that we talked about today, please do not hesitate to reach out to either John or I for more information and for more details. So I want to thank you for taking 30 minutes out of your day today. Hopefully you found it valuable, and hopefully I will see you again next Thursday for another Retail Responds webinar. Thanks a lot and have a great weekend.